We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter number 7. And we're going to consider the subject this morning, living wisely with questions. As Solomon concludes chapter 6, he concludes and leaves us with 3 questions to ponder. And honestly, the questions are rhetorical, but there is no way to know the true or the real answer to those questions. And so you would expect Solomon in chapter 7 to answer those questions, but rather than answering those questions for us in chapter 7, Solomon just presents to us that in light of those questions, here are some ways that we can live wisely in life. And Ecclesiastes chapter 6, Solomon concludes that chapter, and we'll look at those verses with these questions. In chapter 6, verse number 10, we'll go up to verse 11 actually. Solomon says, "Since there are many things that increase vanity." Now, what are those many things? Well, if you go to the beginning of chapter 6, starting in verse number 2, Solomon talks about the love of wealth, the love of riches, the love of honor. He speaks about having many children and long life. And so Solomon, as he concludes the chapter now, here in chapter 6, and leads us into chapter 7, he says, since there are many things, he makes the assumption that we know. Since there are many things that increase vanity, and here's the question: how is man the better? At the end of the day, if we're all buried 6 feet under in the ground, if we have honor, if we have riches, if we have wealth, if we have many children, but we don't live forever, what advantage is that for us? At the end of the day, there is no advantage. But he says in verse number 11 that even if there was an advantage to any of it, we're not even competent to make a judgment call regarding how advantageous something is. In verse number 11, he says, or verse 12, he says, "For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow." And then the third question, and this is what leads us into chapter 7 this morning. The question he poses is this: who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? We have no way of knowing what the outcome of our choices or our decisions will be, because we will never live long enough to see it. We have no premonition of what the future holds. And because we don't know what the future holds, we're kind of in the dark when it comes to making decisions or living wisely in life, because we don't know. We can't comprehend. We can't understand how anything will turn out. I can make this decision. It could turn out this way, or this way. I can make that decision. It could turn out this way, or this way. Solomon says you can't even know that. So how can you even make right decisions if you can't even know the outcome or the answers? And so chapter 7 is Solomon's explanation not to live life in an attempt to answer unanswerable questions. But chapter 7 is about learning how to live life wisely in spite of unanswered questions. And that's the key of chapter 7. And so our topic this morning is living wisely with questions. By design, God has made it so that in life, not everything can be known. And because not everything can be known, we must choose to live life with wisdom. And that's the thrust of chapter 7. Let me ask you this morning, and we'll dive into chapter 7 here. If God answered every "what will happen if I" type of question in advance, would that deepen your dependence upon God? Or would it cause you to exchange your dependence upon God for confidence in outcomes? Let me rephrase it this way. If God answered every "what will happen if I" question in advance, would it teach you to lean on answers rather than on the Lord? And perhaps that's why the questions that Solomon poses at the end of chapter 6, he doesn't provide answers for. Because in chapter 7, his point is not to give us answers, but his point is to help us to live wisely in spite of the fact that we don't have answers to many of life's what if questions. But it would be convenient, wouldn't it? If God did give us the answers to all of our what if type of questions, wouldn't it bring clarity to our present moment if we were able to understand what the outcome would be of every choice or every decision that we make? It sure would. And life, it oftentimes leaves us with more questions than answers. And so that's why Solomon instructs us to live wisely in spite of the fact that in some areas God does not provide answers. And so if life then is not about getting the answers to all of our what if questions, then how does God expect us to navigate life? What if the unanswered questions then in our lives are not problems that need to be solved, but rather the unanswered questions that we have in life are a classroom that God is using to teach us to trust Him, to teach us faith? And that's the thrust of chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 teaches us that wisdom is not God answering every question or explaining life to us, but it is God teaching us how to live faithfully in it. And so Solomon, he points us to wisdom. How do we live faithfully in a world where there are more questions than answers? Well, we live according to wisdom. And that's chapter 7 in a nutshell. God gives us wisdom for living through life where there are no answers. And so Solomon does that in 3 ways. He shows us in chapter 7 3 lessons that wisdom teaches us in regards to living life wisely in spite of the fact that we will die with unanswered questions. And so Solomon, in 3 ways, he does that. First way he does that is he shows us that through wisdom, God reorders our values. God forms wisdom in us by reordering the things that we value. The experiences here in verses 1 through 10 that Solomon addresses and names, death and sorrow and rebuke and patience and restraint. It's not that these experiences automatically make someone wise, but they become formative to growing wisdom in our lives because God uses these unnaturally, these experiences that we try to avoid. He uses them to overturn our natural value system. For example, none of us like to go to funerals. I can't think of one person that says, I can't wait to go to a funeral this Friday. That's not natural. But if someone's throwing a birthday party on Friday, I can't wait to go. You're already thinking, what am I going to wear? What gift am I going to buy? It's going to be so much fun. I'm going to see people that I haven't seen in a long time. And many people, that's what they value, and there's nothing wrong, and Solomon's not saying that is wrong. But when it comes to forming wisdom in our lives, God often goes against our natural instinct. He takes us to places, He takes us to situations not where we're going to be coddled, not where we're going to find enjoyment, but where our faith is going to be stretched, where we're going to be challenged. And that's the reordering of our value system when it comes to wisdom. Wisdom is formed in the difficult places, in the places that naturally we try to avoid. Verse number 1, Solomon says that a good name is better than precious ointment. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is formed in our lives as God corrects those instincts and trains the heart to call better what He calls better. We saw in verse 1, a good name is better than pleasure. Sober reflection in verses 2 through 4 is better than entertainment. Correction in verse 5 is better than the applause of men. Verse 8, endurance, patience, long-suffering. It's better than quick success. Verse 8, patience is better than pride. And verse 10, contentment with the present way that God is ordering our lives is better than the past or nostalgia. And so in these verses, God is just not merely adding these unnatural instincts to a growing list of values that form our wisdom, but rather He is displacing or He is replacing rival values. Instead of the praise of men, we should love correction. And Solomon here is instructing us to value the things that God values. Why should we value the things that God values? Well, because our values determine what we listen to. Our values determine what we endure, what we're willing to endure. Our values determine how we respond to life. And so, if our value is to live for merely joy and for entertainment, when the joy and the entertainment in our life is gone, we're going to think that something in our life is wrong, but it's not. Because God says we're not to live or to value joy and entertainment over reflection and soberness in life. When the past is gone and we're left with a difficult present, if something's wrong in our present, we're going to think that something is wrong completely in our lives. And God says, don't value the present in the way that you value the past. Yes, appreciate, give gratitude to God for the past, but don't always expect the present to be better than the past, because many times there are situations and scenarios in life where the present stinks. The present is terrible. And so don't shape your view or your opinion on life based on a particular moment in your present. Based upon the fact that the past was so much better than the present. And so Solomon, he instructs us and he says that wisdom in our lives is formed by what we value. It's not adding these difficulties or these paradoxes to our value system, but rather it's replacing these values in our value system. An example is Moses. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Moses reordered his values and not merely his circumstances. There in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 24, we read that by faith, Moses, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather, get this, he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God. Only God can do that. God had reordered his value system. He chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Why? Because he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater than the riches and the treasures in Egypt. So Moses, God worked in his heart to reorder the things that he valued. He valued things that are contrary to our natural instinct. Why? Because he wanted to be identified with the people of God and the coming ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so Moses, he lived Ecclesiastes chapter 7 before Ecclesiastes chapter 7 was written. He called better what God called better, even when it meant loss and waiting and reproach. And so living wisely with questions. How does God help us to do that? Well, he doesn't give us the answers, but rather he reorders our values so that we value the things that he values. And then once God has reordered our values, those experiences, such as what are mentioned in chapter 7, death and loss and mournings, situations that we normally want to run from, those values then become instruments of God's grace. And it begins to reshape the way that we think about life itself. And so the first way, the first lesson that we learn as we learn to live wisely with questions is that God, through wisdom, will reorder our values. But secondly, if in verses 1 through 10, God reorders our values through lived experience, then verses 11 through 18 show us that God reforms our thinking about how life actually works under his rule. Solomon in verses 11 through 18, he begins to show us how the mind begins to reason differently once our hearts begin to prize the things that God prizes. And so we're going to have to move quickly. But we begin in verse number 11. We see that God gives us a new judgment about experiences in life. He helps us to think differently about many of those difficult situations in life, or perhaps even change our thinking radically concerning those things that we thought brought value to our life. He says in verse number 11, he tells us that wisdom redefines what we count as an advantage. In verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is as a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Solomon says that wisdom is good alongside wealth, but he adjusts our thinking in a way. Now, money, it can offer protection, but wisdom reorders and preserves life. When God reorders our values, it changes our thinking about money. No longer do we look to money for security, but we look to God's wisdom. We look to it because it is our defense, it is our protection, and it gives life. But in verses 13 through 14, Solomon also tells us that our changed values produce changed thinking in the way that we interpret how God works in life. Verses 13 and 14 tells us about adversity, and another one who enjoys prosperity. And many times when we experience prosperity in life, we automatically assume that we have God's favor. And many times when we experience adversity in life, it's frequent for us to think that perhaps we've done something wrong, or God is chastising us, or that God is punishing us in some way. But wisdom rethinks, or helps us to rethink what we think about those situations. When we experience adversity, it's not always because God is chastising us, but it is perhaps because God is challenging us in our faith. He's growing us in our faith. He's using a difficult situation to strengthen us. And so that's the point here. That's how wisdom, and when we value what God values, that's how it changes our thinking regarding adversity in life. But in verse 15 through 18, it also regulates what we think about righteousness. There are those who have misguided responses to life in a broken world. Some will look to their riches for security and for trust, while others will just throw all caution to the wind, and they'll live life without restraint. But a person who is employing wisdom, whose values have affected the way that they think about life, they will reject trusting in prosperity. They'll also reject trusting in living life for themselves, but they will live in the fear of God, and they'll submit to His authority. And that's not natural. That comes because God has reordered our value system. And so changed values, they lead to changed thinking under God's rule. And then the final point, and we'll be done here real briefly. Once wisdom has shaped what we value and how we think, it inevitably begins to transform how we live. We're going to make decisions based according to God's wisdom in the right mind. We're going to take action according to God's value system and do so in the right mind. Verses 19 through 29, God reshapes our daily living, and He does it because wisdom cultivates humility and restraint and realism before Him. Verse 19, we see that from wisdom, God will give us strength. From wisdom, we'll be refrained in our speech, verses 21 and 22. From wisdom, we'll be realistic about our sin, verses 23, 24, and 29. We'll realize that none of us are righteous apart from God. From wisdom, in verses 25 through 28, we are warned and enabled to discern human schemes. We will live carefully in light of them. And so, in short, wisdom transforms our conduct. It transforms our behavior by keeping us humble, restrained, and honest in life's moments. You could say that wisdom affects us like rumble strips on a highway affect the way we drive. Rumble strips, they're annoying, in my opinion, but they're helpful because they alert us when we drift off course. And in the same way, if we are striving to live by God's wisdom, when we drift off course, God's wisdom is going to alert us and say, get your hands back on the steering wheel, get back on the road, get back in line. That's what wisdom will do for us, and that's how wisdom helps us to live wisely in light of unanswered questions. And so Ecclesiastes chapter 7, as we close, it doesn't ask us to solve the brokenness of our world. It doesn't ask us to untangle every question that we have in our lives. But it teaches us how to live wisely in spite of those things. And living wisely begins with a simple shift. Wisdom is not for providing answers, but wisdom is for leaning on the Lord and trusting Him. And as we do so, He will keep us on the right path. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 sum this thought up beautifully. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And so as we close, maybe this week we could think about, what does God call better here? And does what I value align with what God values? Because if I'm just living for pleasure, if I'm just living for praise, if I'm just living for myself, when I don't receive those things, then I'm going to think that there's something wrong in my life. But God tells us not to value those things, because those things won't help us with wisdom. Maybe perhaps we could think about this week, how does God want me to rightly think about a situation? Perhaps God has reordered your value system, and now you're in the process of, how do I process this? How does God want us to think rightly about our situation? Maybe we could focus on that. And then maybe we need to focus, well, what steps then? I value what God values. I believe I have clarity because I value the things that God values. But then, what do I do about it? What would humble, faithful obedience in that situation look right now for you? So wisdom doesn't remove the uncertainty of life, but it does give us a way forward, a step of trust, restraint, and faithfulness. And wisdom teaches us how to live faithfully when life remains unfinished.